a convulsive march rhythm on side drums and low brass, suddenly cut off. A great stillness created by a sustained bare fifth on the strings, out of which a mysterious, foreboding call arises on horns. The march resumes, and the horn call is developed up to an abrupt, imperious cadence, from which a solo tuba sighs away into the depths. To those who know his music, a passage like this could only be written by Havergal Brian. He has as distinctive, as instantly recognisable a profile in sound as those other great 20th century symphonists, Sibelius, Mahler, Vaughan Williams, Shostakovich, who are his peers. The music I just played is the beginning of his 8th Symphony, an elaborate single-movement work written in 1949. By the end, though perhaps not on a single hearing, we appreciate the significance of all those different elements in Brian's grand design. His musical personality is a complex one, made up of many different elements, but their cumulative effect is to create works of great power and deep feeling, a musical argument that carries the listener along with it while constantly presenting new and often surprising features to his ear. In this talk, I want to isolate some of these various elements in an attempt to identify what makes Havergal Brian tick. What is it that makes his music sound so unmistakably individual? Some of the elements are right there in the passage I played, the beginning of Symphony No. 8. The march rhythm, the juxtaposition of contrasting kinds of music directly against one another with no attempt at a smooth transition, the use of percussion, the liking for the low brass, and indeed the masterly handling of the orchestra as a whole. Brian was primarily, though not solely, an orchestral composer. In the first part of his career he wrote many expressive songs and part songs. There's a small body of piano music and a very few chamber pieces, but mainly he wrote for the orchestra, or the orchestra with voices. There are 5 operas and several imposing works for chorus and orchestra. The most imposing of all, and probably his most famous or notorious work, is his gigantic First Symphony entitled The Gothic, composed between 1919 and 1927. That requires a truly gargantuan lineup of much augmented orchestra, choirs, vocal soloists, children's chorus and brass bands, somewhat in the spirit, but surpassing, the Berlioz Requiem or Mahler's 8th Symphony. No work illustrates better his extraordinary mastery of large forces. The Gothic was only his first symphony, and he was to write 31 more. But it's a wholly mature work. Brian was over 50 years of age by the time he finished it. Partly as a result of the publicity attracted by the various performances of the Gothic, many false ideas about him have gained currency over the years. For a long time, the image that was presented to the popular and even the musical press was of a man who lived to an enormous age, writing an enormous number of enormously long and long-winded symphonies for enormous forces with a complete lack of practicality. in utter isolation from the rest of the musical world and in blissful, if not culpable, ignorance of what anybody else was doing. Let me say right away that virtually all of that image is nonsense. We can't deny that 96 is a great age and that 32 is a large number of symphonies. It's also a fact that Brian experienced an extraordinary quickening of the creative impulse as he got older, so that in the 20 years between the ages of 72 and 92, when he finally ceased composing, he wrote 27 of his symphonies, as well as 4 operas and several other works. A fact which caused his great champion, Dr. Robert Simpson, to refer to him as a rare case of a geriatric prodigy. But then, as Vaughan Williams, Fauré, Verdi and Janacek have shown, music's old men sometimes contribute something of unusual richness and vitality to the repertoire. Are all his 32 symphonies enormously long? No. The Gothic is a unique case. Only 4 of Brian's other symphonies, numbers 2, 3, 4 and 7, go much over half an hour, and the remaining 27 range between 30 minutes and down to a mere 10. So much for long-windedness, a term, you should remember, that people used to apply to Bruckner and Mahler. Far from being long-winded or indulgent, Brian is a naturally concise composer, and part of the trouble for listeners who find his music difficult is the swiftness of his thought and his reluctance to pad his argument out with mere transitions or repetitions. Indeed, he once said that even the Gothic, when the music came to him, was so vivid and intense that he wanted to get it all into about 20 bars. In a sense, the actual 100-minute length of the work is merely the composing out of that concentrated 20-bar flash. Are they all scored for enormous forces? No. Again, the Gothic is a unique case, and the music fully justifies the use of those forces. One other symphony, the 4th, requires a chorus, another is for solo voice and orchestra, and 1 or 2 of the others call for orchestras that are pretty large by most standards. But in general, Brian wrote for the orthodox large orchestra, as that term was understood by Mahler, Elgar and Richard Strauss. Brian assumes as a routine what they also assumed to be routine, though he's quite in line with later 20th century practice in considerably expanding the range and role of the percussion department. As for being cut off from what other people were doing, Brian was an active music journalist for nearly 50 years, from the mid-1900s to the end of the 1940s. And in that time he took the keenest interest in what his contemporaries were doing, attending performances and reading the scores of a quite staggering amount of modern music. So if his style evolved in a different way to that of his contemporaries, it certainly wasn't from ignorance, but from a single-minded pursuit of his own goals, which resulted in a tough but rewarding music unlike any other composer. His mature music is tonal but highly polyphonic and demands the listener's full attention to catch the continual rapid transformations of basic figures. Here's a typical passage from a thoroughly mature work, the 16th Symphony, written in 1960 at the age of 84. As you can hear, the texture here is very active, highly contrapuntal, making full use of the orchestra as the main melodic figures change and metamorphose in a protean manner before our ears. It requires close attention, but it also has a tremendous sweep that carries you along with it. By contrast, there are also moments of profound, otherworldly stillness, in which very little seems to happen, but the music is somehow watchful, waiting, evoking great distances or great darkness. There's a wonderful example of this in the single movement 10th Symphony of 1954. If the music I've played so far is mainly complex or austere, you shouldn't think that Brian's music isn't rich in melody. He often prefers to deal in small, abrupt motifs, but when he wants, he can write a plain-speaking, lyrically appealing melody with the best of them. Contrast is indeed the lifeblood of Brian's music. Contrast between activity and stasis, grandiose and intimate, highly dramatic and lyrically expressive, martial and pastoral. Often all of these within the one movement, and it's out of the balancing of these disparate elements, the way they qualify, undercut or complement each other, that the essential nature of that movement has to emerge. Sometimes the contrast is on the largest scale, for example in his 11th Symphony of 1954. The first movement, very unusually for Brian, is a large, seamless, profoundly lyrical adagio, developing a single mood and character in a more or less constant tempo. But it's succeeded by a big scherzo-like movement in which mood and character and tempo are constantly changing and juxtaposed against one another in distinct blocks. Sometimes, on the one hand, contrast operates almost at the micro level of the music, with changes of character and texture and rhythm almost from bar to bar. The roots of Brian's music lie in the composers he most admired and studied closely. Strauss, Elgar, Berlioz, Wagner, but also Handel, Bach, the English choral tradition right back to the Renaissance, English brass band tradition. We could say that all of these influences come together, are synthesized and transcended in the mighty canvas of the Gothic symphony. Yet even in his earliest works, Brian tends to sound more like himself than anybody else. There are rare moments where he seems to directly echo his great predecessors. Elgar for instance in the symphonic poem In Memoriam of 1910. In the finale of his second symphony, a movement which is basically a large-scale funeral march, there seems to be a quite clear reference to or emulation of Siegfried's funeral march from Wagner's Götterdämmerung. And Handel, at his most monumental, must surely have been the inspiration for the opening of the choral Fourth Symphony, Das Siegeslied, the Psalm of Victory. Sometimes when Brian makes reference to earlier, what we might call historical styles, he seems to be parodying them or questioning them. They are part of music's great legacy, but what do they mean now in the uneasy 20th century? The Fourth Symphony is a particularly interesting case because, composed as it was to a German text, Luther's version of Psalm 68, around the time of Hitler's seizure of power in Germany, it proceeds from that grand Handelian march to music of tremendous violence and chromatic dissonance, as if Brian has stripped away the superficial musical image of triumph to show the barbarity on which that triumph is founded. Several of the examples I've played so far are, in effect, marches, and I'd like to add a few more. Brian clearly felt march music at a very profound level, from the repertoire of the brass bands and village bands he followed as a child to the organ marches he loved to play as a teenage organist in Odd Road Church in Cheshire. He is one of the most complete and resourceful masters of the use of march music within symphonic forms, and in this he resembles not only Gustav Mahler, whose music he did not come to know until the late 1920s, but also Edward Elgar, who was one of his greatest musical heroes from the 1890s. And like both Elgar and Mahler, he was also influenced by the great examples of Beethoven, Berlioz and Wagner in the use of the march to make a dramatic impact in symphonic works and in music drama. The march came to mean many things to Brian, and it has many different functions in his symphonic designs, from a mere hint of march rhythm at a particular point in the structure to entire movements laid out as marches on an epic scale. Here's an early example of a military march functioning as a subject in a more or less sonata form movement, Brian's overture For Valour. His symphonies often begin with a march rhythm as a means of getting the argument moving. We've already heard the openings of Symphonies 4 and 8. Here's the epic surge of the march rhythm at the opening of Symphony No. 3, music that immediately sets up the image of journeying through a rugged landscape. By contrast, here's a much later symphony, number 18 from 1962, altogether leaner and more focused, but the march rhythm gets the music down to business right away. Not all Brian's marches are in 4/4. He's too canny a composer to fall into the trap of rhythmic uniformity. He can write them in 3/4 or even 5/4. The Gothic symphony, among many other things, contains a whole compendium of different kinds of marches. Notably, most of its second movement is cast as a kind of funeral march in 5/4 time that rises to some titanic climaxes. A funeral march of a very different kind, an eerie, fragmented but baleful one, features in the 12th Symphony of 1957, which we know was inspired by Aeschylus's tragedy Agamemnon. Perhaps it stands for the king's death, more likely for the inexorable workings of fate, a concept to which Brian related strongly. As you'll have noticed in that and some previous examples, the musical invention is sustained and coloured by some wonderfully effective and imaginative use of the percussion section. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is another of Brian's hallmarks. He was always interested in the many different kinds of percussion instruments and sought to enlarge the department's role. An early orchestral work, the Festal Dance of 1908, actually begins with a passage for the percussion alone, virtually unheard of for that date. A work like the Gothic symphony uses a huge amount of percussion, including many different kinds of drum, plus bells, cymbals, thunder sheet, chains, a bird scare, and other exotica. But perhaps the most striking percussive passage is the long, extremely virtuosic solo for the xylophone that occurs towards the end of the third movement. Later in Brian's career, his percussion body had stabilised. His standard percussion section requires about 7 players, at the centre of which will be not 1 but 3 side drums, usually, though not always, playing in unison. He said that he had grown dissatisfied with the weak tone of a single drum when pitted against the orchestra, and preferred the full, heavy, powerful sound of a trio of drums. Now here's an interesting and haunting example from Brian's 6th Symphony, the Sinfonia Tragica, originally conceived as the prelude to a projected opera on J.M. Synge's tragedy Deirdre of the Sorrows. Here, 3 side drums in unison accompany 3 flutes, also in unison. To this percussion body he added, more or less routinely, xylophone, glockenspiel, bass drum, cymbals both clashed and suspended, triangle, tambourine, and gong. He could use the gong with extraordinary poetic effect. Several works end with a single resonating gong stroke, as if dissolving the whole of the elaborately shaped preceding argument back into the realm of raw, inchoate sound. Here's the way the 12th Symphony ends, for instance. Brian's superb handling of the brass instruments has often been commented on. He handled them with love and daring, both individually and as a body, using all the usual orchestral brass and sometimes extras such as a euphonium as well. That very first example I played, the opening of the 8th Symphony, is a duet for euphonium and tuba, and he often makes the tuba sing in a way that almost no other composer has. Also, his music is full of fanfares, or fanfare-like figures. Here's the opening of the 7th Symphony, a brilliant fanfare for 4 trumpets with percussion. In the second movement of the same symphony, we suddenly come across what seems like a marching band, maybe like one of the brass bands that Brian followed in his childhood, but tremendously vividly evoked in the context of a symphonic scherzo and a tremendous piece of scoring for the brass as a whole. It's as if a street scene from a country town has suddenly come to life. That's just one of many ways that Brian uses his music to create a sense of drama, sometimes almost an opera without words. Events pass before our ears and we seem caught up in a story whose specifics we may not know, but to which we have become auditory observers. Here's a very different example from the Sinfonia Tragica. This is almost Brian's version of Forest Murmurs, giving the sense that mysterious events are taking place off stage. It's in the context of that dramatic use of sound and unexpected episodes that I want to talk about one of the features of Brian's symphonism that has perhaps most often disconcerted his critics. That's his love of discontinuity. His habit, for example, of breaking off a development in mid-stride, or a climax just before it gets to the clinching cadence, and introducing something completely different. For some critics, this simply shows incoherence, or the inability to construct a satisfying design. To those who go deeper into the music, however, these discontinuities are quite clearly intentional. They're meant to bring us up short and to think about what the music is doing. Here's an example from the second movement of the 7th Symphony. A bit before the brass band march I played you earlier, Brian constructs another trumpet fanfare, a very angry one this time, and he drives it to a superbly wrathful climax. Yet in the blink of an eye, he cuts to a cheeky, dancing oboe tune that seems to be thumbing its nose at all the sound and fury. Here's a different kind of example from the 17th Symphony of 1961. The passage begins and ends with noble-sounding, quite heavily chordal music, but in the middle there is a contrasting and at first hearing rather irrelevant series of expressive roulades on a solo flute. It takes several hearings to realize that this relates to material previously heard and which will be developed later. Now, Brian is hardly the first composer to have discovered the value of contrast, but it's the way he presents and heightens these contrasts that is often so individual, and the many purposes he makes them serve. He may be showing us the material from a new angle, or providing a change of direction at just the right moment, or it may be a first intimation of something that will become important later on. It seems to me that these productive discontinuities in Brian's music, as the composer and Brian enthusiast John Pickard has called them, mirror an important aspect of life. Most of us have experienced being involved in a great enterprise that peters out unexpectedly, hopes that have come to nothing, and then something quite different and unanticipated happens elsewhere in our lives and opens up a new path. On the more day-to-day level, you get up in the morning, the post brings a letter informing you that an old friend has died. You go out, and there's a band marching down the street. In the distance you hear two people arguing. You see a man cross the road, and he narrowly escapes being hit by a car. It's been cloudy, but now the sun comes out briefly in splendour. That's what the texture of life is like, full of disparate, apparently random and unrelated events. But they are related, both by the fact that we perceive them all, and also because we're prone to think about them afterwards and maybe seek to find a link, a pattern, a reason, a meaning in them. It's clear that Havergal Brian, who once in a very black moment went out to buy a gun to shoot himself with and came back with a chicken for the pot, was very aware of this aspect of life, its fragmented texture, its apparent happenstance, the randomness that practically defies you to find a meaning for it. He was a believer in fate, and in what he sometimes referred to as the hidden hand that influenced the events of human life. In one sense, it's this aspect of the human condition that his music evokes and shows us. He makes us into the observers, and the hidden hand is his. But he also believed that it was important not to give in to the randomness. It was important to struggle, to discover meaning. On the title page of the Gothic, he puts a quotation from Goethe's Faust: "Whoever strives with all his might, that man we can redeem." That sense of struggle, the struggle for meaning, resounds through his symphonies, and it's what makes them such a thrilling spiritual journey. I don't want to give the impression that all Brian's symphonies are like this. Some of them, especially among the later symphonies, are fairly seamless, continually developing salient figures in ongoing contrapuntal invention. He himself likened this kind of texture to fugue technique, though he writes comparatively few formal fugues. There's a lot of canons and lots of free invention in 3, 4 or more voices. Again, he writes comparatively few movements in sonata form, with its pattern of exposition, development and recapitulation, usually with two groups of ideas being played off against one another. There are a few movements like this, but more often he adapts sonata style by having a roughly 3-part structure in which the subjects are small motifs that start to be developed right away, so that you may have 3 well-marked stages in a continual process of development in which the very subjects change their shape and identity through the movement. But very often he combines this with the productive discontinuity idea. The continuing development is interrupted or suddenly has a window in it where we glimpse something entirely different that enlarges or qualifies or undercuts the main argument. Here's an example from the 25th Symphony, completed in January 1966, just before his 90th birthday. Partly because the music is so much an ongoing process, a process of development, but also a process of discovery, and also a drama that has some of the enigmatic quality of life itself, that Brian often leaves you with a sense that his forms are open-ended. I don't mean that the symphonies sound in any way unfinished. He virtually always writes magnificent endings, just as he virtually always writes striking beginnings. But they never seem to come up with easy or comforting answers, and they often seem to point beyond themselves. To the next symphony, perhaps. 2 groups of 3 symphonies, numbers 8, 9 and 10, and numbers 22, 23 and 24, do seem to form trilogies, discussing not so much the same material as the same atmospheres and human issues, and looking at forms from different angles. But generally, it's more like there's always more to be said. No one symphony can fully contain Brian's musical exploration of the human predicament as he saw it. and yet he virtually never repeats himself. Each work has its own distinct profile, atmosphere, expressive charge. I played the black, tragic ending of the 12th Symphony earlier in this talk. I'd like to leave you with 3 examples of the ways Brian ends a symphony. The 10th seems to stare impassively at the night sky, which stares just as impassively back, a wonderfully poetic ending. The 16th Symphony has a coda that seems to compress all its salient material into a few titanic bars of daring rhythmic and harmonic invention. And the 9th Symphony goes out in a blaze of brass and bells and dancing rhythms that for me is one of the most affirmative passages in all of Havergal Brian. Here, as in all the other illustrations I've used, genius and craftsmanship have given birth to a unique and I feel uniquely inspiring music.